All right. It's going to be Acts chapter 18, verse 1. After these things, Paul departed from Athens and came to Corinth, and found a certain Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus, lately come from Italy, with his wife Priscilla, because that Claudius had commanded all Jews to depart from Rome, and came unto them. And because he was of the same craft, he abode with them, and wrought, for by their occupation they were tent makers. And he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath, and persuaded the Jews and the Greeks. And when Silas and Timotheus were come from Macedonia, Paul was pressed in the Spirit, and testified to the Jews that Jesus was Christ. And when they opposed themselves and blasphemed, he shook his raiment, said unto them, Your blood be upon your own heads. I am clean. From henceforth I will go to the Gentiles. And he departed thence, and entered into a certain man's house, named Justus, one that worshipped God, whose house joined hard to the synagogue. And Crispus, the chief ruler of the synagogue, believed on the Lord with all his house. And many of the Corinthians, hearing, believed, and were baptized. Then spake the Lord to Paul in the night by a vision, Be not afraid, but speak, and hold not thy peace. For I am with thee, and no man shall set on thee to hurt thee, for I have much people in this city. And he continued there a year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them. And when Gallio was the deputy of Achaia, the Jews made an insurrection with one accord against Paul, and brought him to the judgment seat, saying, This fellow persuadeth men to worship God contrary to the law. And when Paul was now about to open his mouth, Gallio said unto the Jews, If it were a matter of wrong or wicked lewdness, O ye Jews, reason would that I should bear with you. But if it be a question of words and names and of your law, look ye to it, for I will be no judge of such matters. And he drave them from the judgment seat. Then all the Greeks took Sosthenes, the chief ruler of the synagogue, and beat him before the judgment seat. And Gallio cared for none of these things. And Paul after this tarried there yet a good while, and then took his leave of the brethren, and sailed thence into Syria. And with him Priscilla and Aquila, having shorn his head in Cenchrea, for he had a vow. Paul shaved his head, and he came to Ephesus, and left them there. But he himself entered into the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. When they desired him to tarry a longer time with them, he consented not, but bade them farewell, saying, I must by all means keep this feast that cometh in Jerusalem, but I will return again unto you, if God will. And he sailed from Ephesus. And when he had landed at Caesarea and gone up, and saluted the church, he went down to Antioch. And after he had spent some time there, he departed and went over all the country of Galatia and Phrygia in order, strengthening all the disciples. And a certain Jew named Apollos, born in Alexandria, an eloquent man and mighty in the Scriptures, came to Ephesus. This man was instructed in the way of the Lord, and being fervent in the Spirit, he spake and taught diligently the things of the Lord, knowing only the baptism of John. And he began to speak boldly in the synagogue, whom when Aquila and Priscilla had heard, they took him unto them, and expounded unto him the way of God more perfectly. And when he was disposed to pass into Achaia, the brethren wrote, exhorting the disciples to receive him, who, when he was come, helped them much which had believed through grace, for he mightily convinced the Jews, and that publicly showing by the scriptures that Jesus was Christ. Okay, so there's kind of a lot here, but I want to kind of say that this isn't as interesting as some of the other ones, but, there's no miracles here, and talking to a brother today that said one of the reasons he really likes Acts is because of all the miracles that the apostles performed, which is really cool, but there's not really any miracles here. There's not really any big sermons here. There's just, there's a little bit though. I mean, God spoke to Paul, and Paul departed from some people, and then it talks about some new people. It says Paul shaved his head. More Jews converted. Guess what does it say? Paul stayed in this place for 1 year and 6 months after God told him, not to be afraid. The Corinthians. And so there's also the story. I mean, I don't know if I truly understand everything here, but what was it? Paul was brought before a council to be condemned, but this Gallio guy, it says he was the deputy of Achaia, and he basically said that so the Greeks beat the ruler of the synagogue. So they thought, I don't know, they thought basically that what they brought Paul for to be condemned was nonsense. He just thought it was, their matter, and it was maybe just a waste of his time or something. It wasn't really a crime in his eyes. And so instead of, judging Paul, they judged the ruler of the synagogue, pretty much judged the people that brought Paul forth to be judged. That's how I read it. So that is an interesting story. I mean, yeah, there is stuff here, but I just liked Acts chapter 17 so much, with the sermon to the pagans, basically. But still good stuff, and I'll continue on to Acts chapter 19, only 10 more to go. So, God bless.